Hello and welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Gabriel the Bibi Capaldi and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please do check down below that you are subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and helps us pop up on your feed a bit more often. Iliara was devastated. Not only had 5 full revolutions passed since her clan's matriarch had ordered her to choose a mate from another species, but her own family was also pursuing her to make a choice now. Today, it was getting even worse, as even her friend Titter was insisting she go to her living room to see something called a human. "I'm not dressing up," Iliara declared to her reflection in the mirror, her voice hinting at the 5 years' worth of defiance, 5 years of scrutinizing alien warriors, scholars, and merchants, each one a potential candidate, each one a disappointment. "And I'm certainly not adorning my hair with flowers or ancestral combs. The only reason I'm even considering going outside is because you won't stop pestering me about this human." She spat the word out as if it tasted foul. Iliara ignored Titter and turned to face the mirror, taking in her reflection. Her long dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, the single blue streak that ran through it, stealing all attention from her face. She'd inherited that streak from her grandmother, one of the few traits that had bred true through the generations. Her long, pointed ears protruded through the dark strands, trembling slightly with her annoyance. The dark purple of her skin seemed less vivid today, while the white spots that covered her body hadn't changed in her eyes. Her 2 small fangs protruded slightly even with her mouth closed, giving her what her mother called a perpetually fierce expression. Good. Let this human see her at her most intimidating. The simple dress she'd chosen hung loosely on her frame, doing nothing to accentuate her figure. Perfect. She had no intention whatsoever of appealing to this creature. Iliara turned around to face Titter, their yellow eyes meeting across the elegant but somewhat cluttered room. Titter's face immediately lit up with a smile, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her bright, intelligent eyes, a smile Iliara had learned to dissect as the telltale sign of an imminent argument. "If you don't dress up properly, present yourself as the high-ranking Visarian you are, you'll regret it later," Titter said as her smile changed. "First impressions matter if you want to get the human in your bed, Iliara." Iliara recognized that particular facial configuration. It was an expression Titter had perfected over the years. It projected an "I am your friend, but you are acting like a child" vibe that Titter managed so effortlessly. Her low stature, barely reaching Iliara's shoulder, and her surprisingly high-pitched voice only added to the unsettling effect, making her seem both deceptively harmless and unexpectedly dangerous all at once. "Get him in my bed? I thought you were on my side," Iliara said, the hurt in her voice raw and undeniable. "I thought you, of all people, would help me avoid having to choose an alien mate at all costs. We were supposed to find another way, to prove to the clan council that this whole desperate idea of improving our immune system by mixing our genes with some Death Worlder alien species is absurd and unfair." Titter's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes softened. "I did agree with you about this, Iliara. For years I agreed. But as I've grown older during these last 5 revolutions," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I've come to understand the Council's vision. Mixing with sapient aliens is much preferable to going fully artificial as the southern clans are trying to do. And it's certainly better than what the northern clans have already successfully done, mixing themselves with animals." Iliara's mind recoiled at both ideas. The thought of replacing their natural biology with artificial enhancements, becoming more machine than Visarian, filled her with a deep revulsion, but the northern clan's solution was equally repugnant, mixing themselves with non-sapient species to create hybrid offspring that were stronger, faster, more resilient, but at what cost to their Visarian identity? Their very souls? No, neither path was acceptable. "There's a third option," Iliara said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "We could give up space exploration entirely. Perhaps the fact that our species evolved with a weak immune system is a sign that we should stay on our own world and keep all aliens away from here. We could keep our blood pure, keep Visar a planet exclusive for the Visarian people." Titter's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "I used to argue with you on that too. But since the matriarch assigned me to a diplomatic role, I've seen the reports, Iliara. I've seen what the other clans are capable of. If we give up space, they'll outgrow us within decades." She began pacing, her small form radiating an energy that belied her stature. "The northern clans have already established their first colony on a Class 1 death world. They don't even need spacesuits anymore to survive there, with their improved biology. At the current rate of expansion, the other clans will surpass our economy in a single decade. If we refuse the change, it will only be a matter of time before they expand, get numbers, and then come back to settle old grievances." "We made a pact," Iliara said in anger, denying what she had been told. "A solemn vow. We made a blood oath that we would rather face exile than mixing ourselves with other species." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion hardening her gaze. "How much did you gain, Titter? What position of influence did they offer you to become such a willing puppet of the clan?" Titter's yellow eyes flashed with a sudden, fierce anger, her small frame tensing, her composure momentarily shattering. "I never betrayed our oath. How dare you suggest such a thing? I am doing what I genuinely believe is best for you, for our people, for the survival of our species." "Oh, how remarkably convenient that what you now think is best just happens to coincide perfectly with the matriarch's unwavering orders." Iliara shot back, sarcasm dripping from her words. Titter exploded, her voice reaching a pitch that made Iliara's ears ring. "I would never do that!" She whirled around, facing away from Iliara, her gaze fixed on the paintings that adorned the walls, ancient depictions of Visarian victories, of unity, of strength. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, controlled but still vibrating with emotion. "For your information, this human wasn't chosen by the matriarch. He hasn't been received on our world as an honored guest. He simply had a problem with his ship and landed here for repairs." Tears were now streaming freely down Titter's face by the time she finished, her small shoulders shaking with the force of her confession. Iliara felt a wave of guilt wash over her, potent and immediate. She realized in that moment that she could blame the universe for her difficult situation. She could blame the warring clans and their brutal history. She could even blame the unyielding matriarch, but not Titter. Titter, despite her changed perspectives, was undoubtedly, in her own complicated way, the only person in the entire clan who truly wanted the best for her, even if her methods were sometimes manipulative, like bringing a human to her home and expecting her to like it. Iliara moved closer, her earlier anger dissolving into remorse, reaching out a tentative hand. "Titter, I'm so sorry. But Titter only avoided her gaze, remaining silent, her small shoulders still shaking slightly as she struggled to regain her composure. "You win," Iliara said softly, trying to inject a sliver of conciliation into her voice. "I'll go. I'll see the human." She paused, then added with more genuine earnestness. "I'm really sorry, Titter. I didn't mean what I said about you being a puppet. That was cruel and untrue." Long, heavy moments passed, filled only with the sound of Tita's quiet sniffling, before she finally looked up at Iliara. When she did, she was smiling again. "I just want you to be happy, Iliara," she said quietly, "or at least content. And from what little I've observed of him, this human, he might be the second best thing, considering the matriarch forbade you from dating anyone from our own species." Iliara felt a lump form in her throat at her friend's painfully honest words. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, lest her own emotions betray her. "Come on, then," Tita said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Let's go, before he starts to get suspicious about where his supposed spaceship engineer has disappeared to for so long." They left Iliara's room together, walking down the long, vaulted corridor that connected the private residential wing to the main entertainment areas of the sprawling ancestral house. "I'm turning around immediately if he has antennae," Iliara said, making a valiant attempt to lighten the mood, to recapture some of their old, easy banter. "Or more than 2 eyes, like those insectoid matches the matriarch arranged for me last season. I still have nightmares about those wiggling things on their heads and their clicking mandibles." Tita actually laughed, a genuine, relieved sound this time, not her diplomatic chuckle. "No antennae, I promise. And definitely only 2 eyes. Standard bipedal configuration, more or less." Their friendlier tone, a fragile truce, continued as they reached the grand staircase that spiraled down to the lower levels. The tension from their earlier argument seemed to dissipate like morning mist. Just before they began to descend, Tita gripped Iliara's arm, her small hand surprisingly strong. "Remember," her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I told him I'm an engineer, a good one, specialized in off-world ship systems. We need to keep that story straight, at least for tonight. If he thinks we're just some rich family trying to lure him for procreation, we'll scare him away before you even get a chance to say hello." Iliara nodded, a small, skeptical frown playing on her lips. She wondered what kind of being this human was. The previous species she'd been formally introduced to, often from warrior cultures or rigidly hierarchical societies, had all been transparently eager to form an alliance. They didn't even seem opposed to the prospect of mating with a Viserion of noble blood to produce a new, more resistant hybrid species. The duo descended the wide stone stairs slowly, Iliara's hand trailing along the cool, carved balustrade. As they neared the bottom, she could hear voices coming from the main living room, a deeper, unfamiliar timbre mingling with the lighter tones of one of their household attendants, probably Lyra, who Tita must have left to entertain their guest. Her heart began to beat faster, a nervous rhythm against her ribs, though she told herself it was just residual anxiety about another pointless, uncomfortable, and ultimately doomed meeting, another evening of forced smiles and polite evasions. Then they reached the arched entrance to the living room, and Iliara got her first, unobstructed glimpse of the human. Time seemed to freeze, to stretch and warp like heated glass. It lasted barely 2 seconds, a mere flutter in the grand tapestry of existence, but in that brief, crystalline moment, her entire world, her carefully constructed defences, her 5 years of resolute defiance, shifted on its axis. Her eyes settled first on his cropped hair, dark brown, almost black, and surprisingly soft, lying close to his scalp. A wave of profound, almost absurd relief flooded through her when she saw, with absolute certainty, that there were no horns, no crests, no strange plates, and, most importantly, no antennae protruding from his head. Her gaze moved swiftly to his face, finding features that were not entirely alien, not disturbingly asymmetrical or unsettlingly predatory. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, all arranged in a configuration that was almost quantitatively pleasant, harmonious, even. But it was when her critical, appraising eyes fell on his broad chest, the width of his shoulders, that her reaction became undeniably visceral, bypassing her intellect entirely. Her eyes widened, a fraction more than just curiosity would dictate, and her jaw dropped a bit, almost imperceptibly. He was sitting at their expansive dining table, which was already partially set for the evening meal, wearing what looked like a simple, unadorned shirt of dark fabric. Yet, the way it stretched across his shoulders, hinting at the musculature beneath, the way his very presence seemed to fill the space around him with an elusive solidity, it was compelling. Titter, ever observant, quickly, almost violently, pulled her back behind the ornate doorframe, out of his line of sight, pressing close and whispering urgently, her earlier solemnity forgotten. "Well, what do you think? Quickly? Is he acceptable?" Iliara struggled to articulate a coherent thought, her usually nimble mind fumbling for words. Her mouth opened and closed several times, like a startled fish, before she finally managed to stammer. "Ah, our kids, they wouldn't have antennae, or weird, disturbing bone protrusions, or those awful, writhing tentacles on their faces like the Zeat." Titter's laughter, when it came, was a contained explosion of mirth and triumph. "Your kids? Iliara, you don't even know his name. You haven't even properly seen his face yet. Gods of Visar, you work fast when you're interested." A sudden, intense heat flooded Iliara's face, turning her deep purple skin an even darker, richer shade, a blush that spread from her neck to the tips of her pointed ears. "I didn't mean... I wasn't... I was just observing that from a purely objective, genetic standpoint, if one were to hypothetically consider the potential offspring of such a pairing." Titter cut off her flustered rambling with a knowing, infuriating smirk. "So let me guess. You want to go back upstairs and perhaps reconsider your wardrobe? Maybe brush that magnificent hair of yours?" The embarrassment that crashed over Iliara was almost a physical blow, making her want to sink through the polished stone floor. She pressed her back against the cool wool of the corridor, her unique white spots seeming to shift with her mortification. Maybe, but only because these clothes are suddenly incredibly uncomfortable. This dress is definitely itching, and my hair, it absolutely needs brushing. It's a mess, and—" "Go," Titter said, her voice laced with amusement, giving her a gentle but firm push toward the stairs. "Go, go, go! I'll keep him entertained." Iliara didn't need to be told twice. She practically fled, her earlier defiant pronouncements utterly forgotten, racing back up the stairs to her room, her heart pounding in her chest for reasons she didn't dare to examine too closely, reasons that felt suspiciously like anticipation, hope. It was terrifying. The next hour was a blur. She pulled dress after dress from her capacious wardrobe, a rainbow of silks, velvets, and intricately woven fabrics cascading onto her bed and chairs. Each one was examined intensely, and then discarded for a multitude of hastily conceived reasons. Too formal, too stuffy, too casual, too revealing, not nearly revealing enough, the wrong shade of blue, the wrong cut for her ears. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of indecision, she settled on a gown of the deepest midnight blue, a colour that perfectly complemented the vibrant blue streak in her hair. She then brushed her hair and adjusted all fine details. When she finally looked in the mirror again, she barely recognized herself. The deliberately plain, defiant girl from just an hour ago had been replaced by someone who looked elegant, sophisticated, beautiful, worthy, like someone who might actually be noticed by... The thought struck her, interrupting her self-admiration. When had she started caring about being noticed? When had the opinion of some random, unknown alien male begun to matter? This was dangerous territory. She glanced at the chronometer on her wall, and a fresh wave of panic seized her. She'd been gone far too long. An entire hour. What if he'd grown bored and left? What if Titter's increasingly outlandish excuses about mechanic duties had worn thin? The very idea, which would have filled her with grim satisfaction only a short while ago, now sent her racing back down the stairs, her gown flowing behind her like a river of midnight. When she reached the living room, gliding in with what she hoped was an air of elegance rather than breathless haste, she found the human sitting alone at the large, circular dining table. Titter was nowhere to be seen. The table was now fully set with gleaming Viserion crystal and intricate silverware, a selection of colourful, fragrant dishes already laid out. He looked up as she entered, his attention drawn to her, and their eyes met for the first time. Truly met, without the barrier of a doorway or the filter of her initial shock. Her confident steps became hesitant as she forced herself to approach him, her intended nonchalance evaporating under his direct gaze. He was even more striking up close than she had initially perceived. His eyes, she now saw, were a warm, deep brown, like the rich bark of the sacred Ileana trees in the temple gardens, flecked with tiny glints of gold. Their first conversation was predictably, painfully awkward. "Where's Titter?" Iliara asked, gesturing vaguely toward the empty spaces at the table. Your friend, the ship engineer," he replied. "She excused herself to go to the restroom, I believe you call it, just a moment ago. Said something about needing to wash grease off her hands, but she's talked about you nonstop for the past hour, about how beautiful and accomplished you are within your clan. A scholar and an artist, I believe she mentioned." He paused, studying her face with an open, unreadable expression. "You're Iliara, aren't you?" She nodded, for a moment not trusting her voice, then remembered her manners, the ingrained politeness of her upbringing. "Yes, I am Iliara of Clan Suleria. And you are?" Miguel Salazar," he said, inclining his head slightly in a gesture that seemed informal. "Titta mentioned that my ship might take as long as a month to fix. Some critical component needs to be sourced from off-world. She was very kind and said that you often have many spare rooms, and are known for your hospitality, that you frequently accommodate aliens who find themselves stranded on your planet by accident. She said I could probably stay here, if it wasn't too much trouble." Iliara instantly recognized this as another of Titter's increasingly elaborate, creative lies. Their estate was vast, yes, but they weren't a public guest house for stranded intergalactic travelers. Yet she found it oddly endearing that this human, Miguel, had believed it so readily, so naively. "Yes, of course," she said, surprising herself with how smoothly the lie came, how easily she slipped into the role Titter had crafted. "We have plenty of space. I enjoy helping those in need. It is a tradition of my clan." Relief washed over his features, and he touched his chest briefly in what looked like a gesture of gratitude or perhaps sincerity. "Thank you. That's incredibly generous. I was worried about the cost. How much will this accommodation set me back?" Panic fluttered in Iliara's chest. Payment? She had absolutely no idea what story Titter might have concocted regarding financial agreements. Her friend hadn't briefed her on this particular detail. "Oh, well," she said, her mind racing, trying to think like Titter. "The truth is, I need some assistance around the estate. It's an old house, you see, very large, and far too much for me to maintain properly alone with my current staff. If you're willing to help with some light duties, you can stay for free. Consider it an exchange of services." The lie felt flimsy, even to her own ears, but it was the best she could do on short notice. He sighed, a visible wave of relaxation passing through his shoulders. That's great. That's really great. I'm quite handy, actually. I can fix almost anything. Iliara finally joined him at the table, gesturing for him to remain seated. She noticed, with a flicker of amusement, that her friend had already prepared a place for her directly across from the human. The strategic positioning would force them to look at each other throughout the entire meal. Fearing the potential awkwardness of sustained, direct eye contact, especially given her current internal state, she quickly sought a neutral topic. "So, Miguel, how did you end up with a defective ship stuck here on our rather remote world?" It must have been a mistake by the engineers at the previous refueling station, Miguel said, a slight, almost imperceptible frown crossing his features. A faulty diagnostic check, I think. It certainly had nothing to do with my ship being old. She found the way he phrased it a bit strange, the subtle defensiveness about his ship's age or condition, but she decided not to dwell on it. Instead, she guided the conversation towards safer, more general topics.
"What is it that you do for a living, Miguel? What kind of business brings you to this relatively untraveled part of the galaxy?"
I'm a space advent. He cut himself off abruptly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, then cleared his throat. An entrepreneur, yeah, a trader of sorts. I have dealings with a rather powerful and reclusive species located a few systems from here. I was on my way to finalize some important trading deals with some rich aliens. Again, Iliara found his phrasing slightly odd, a little too vague, and she was fairly certain that there weren't any other major spacefaring species or significant trading hubs in the nearby systems. But she didn't press the issue. She was, after all, engaged in her own elaborate deception. Instead, she let the conversation flow, guiding it towards his homeworld, his culture. As the evening progressed, the initial awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a surprising ease. Iliara found herself genuinely fascinated by his stories of Earth and humanity. He spoke of vast oceans that covered most of his planet, of sprawling, glittering cities that reached toward the sky like grasping fingers, of billions of humans living together in a state of what he termed relative harmony.
"What about your clan? I mean, your family?"
she asked at one point, after he'd inquired about the structure of Vissarian society.
"Won't they worry about you being gone for so long? Potentially a month or more?"
A shadow, fleeting but definite, crossed his face, and the light in his warm brown eyes seemed to dim for a moment. I don't have much family left, he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the half-eaten plate before him. My parents passed some years ago, and my only sibling, we're not close. It's just me, really. Has been for quite a while. The loneliness in his voice, the quiet resignation, resonated with something deep inside her, a familiar ache. She understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to feel profoundly alone, even when surrounded by the numbers of a clan, a household, a world. It was only when the evening had deepened into true night, when the twin moons of Vissar were visible, and Iliara had spent hours maintaining the increasingly complex web of lies about Titta being a genius mechanic, and herself being a benevolent, if slightly eccentric, soul who routinely housed strange aliens, that Titta finally reappeared. She was accompanied by a stern-faced Vissarian male Iliara didn't recognize. Apparently, according to Titta's breezy explanation, a local transport specialist, who would guide Miguel back to his landed ship so he could retrieve his personal belongings and any essential equipment for Titta to examine the full extent of the damage properly in her workshop tomorrow. After Miguel had departed with his silent guide, expressing his heartfelt gratitude to Iliara once more for her hospitality, Titta didn't even ask how the dinner had gone, didn't pry for details or reactions. Instead, she simply, almost clinically, placed a small, unassuming vial in Iliara's hand. The container was no bigger than her thumb, crafted from a dark, non-reflective material, and filled with a silvery, viscous liquid that seemed to move with a life of its own.
"This is the nanotech our clan developed,"
Titta said matter-of-factly, her voice devoid of its earlier emotion, all business now.
"Custom formulated based on the genetic material I collected from a sample of his hair. It will rearrange your genetics at a fundamental level, identify and bridge any biological gaps. It will bring full reproductive capability to the table."
She paused, her yellow eyes boring into Iliara's.
"Use it wisely, and only if you're absolutely certain."
And then she was gone, sweeping out of the room at once, leaving Iliara standing alone in the vast, silent living room. Iliara stared at the vial nestled in her palm in utter silence. A million questions, a million doubts swirled in her mind. When should she use it? How could she possibly know if Miguel was genuinely interested in her romantically? What if he rejected her? What if he somehow found out about all the lies, the manipulation, the sheer audacity of their scheme? She closed her fingers tightly around the vial, feeling its heavy presence against her palm. It felt like the weight of her entire future. For the first time in 5 long, defiant years, she was actually, seriously, considering taking the step she'd sworn to herself, to Titta, to the memory of their youthful idealism, that she never, ever would. Yet, even as the possibility shimmered before her, a wave of her old stubbornness, a deep-seated aversion to such a profound and artificial intervention, washed over her. Was she truly this desperate? No, not yet. Perhaps not ever. Telling herself there was no way she would actually bring herself to use it, she crossed to her dresser and stored the vial in a dark drawer, burying it beneath a pile of old letters and discarded trinkets. Out of sight, but not entirely out of mind, something that would prove true in just 1 month of cohabitation with this human. 6 months later, Iliara woke to an unnerving, unfamiliar silence. The absence hit her immediately, even before she fully opened her eyes. The usual snoring she had grown accustomed to over the past half-year, the gentle rise and fall of Miguel's breathing beside her, was conspicuously, alarmingly absent. She turned over in the large, comfortable bed, her hand instinctively reaching across the space where Miguel usually lay. Panic, cold and sharp, began to uncoil in her stomach. He was there, she realized with a jolt, but he was rigid, frozen in place, staring intently at the ceiling of their bedchamber with an expression she'd never witnessed on his face before. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscles straining along his neck. His hands were fisted at his sides, and he didn't even acknowledge her stirring, her presence. This was wrong, terribly wrong. Normally, he would have woken her much earlier with what he called a kiss, that strange, wonderful human custom of pressing lips together, a gesture of affection she had come to cherish more than she could ever openly admit, more than any traditional Viserian courtship ritual. Her mind, still fuzzy with sleep, raced through 1,000 dreadful possibilities. Had he somehow finally discovered some of her meticulously constructed lies? The pile of deceptions had grown truly enormous, almost comically so, during their 6 months of cohabitation, with Titta spinning increasingly absurd excuses about why his ship wasn't fixed yet. Or perhaps it was something infinitely worse. Perhaps he'd somehow figured out that she'd used the nanotech 5 long months ago. After weeks of agonizing indecision, finally surrendering to her heart's desperate plea, and the prospect of finally being free of the pressure her clan was placing on her to choose an alien mate. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Miguel, why are you so tense this morning?" He didn't look at her when he finally spoke, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "I can't do this anymore." Panic, sharp and icy, clawed at her throat. "Do what? What do you mean? Us?" Was this it? Was he about to turn violent? Would he accuse her of lying and then go away? His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a raw, desperate emotion she couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't anger. It was anguish. I'm not an entrepreneur, he said in a rush, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken within him. I'm not even a trader. I can't keep lying to you anymore, Iliara. Not for another day, not for another hour. Every single time Tida shows up here, telling me there's another problem with my ship, that it's not ready yet, that it'll take another week, another month. I see it as a miracle. A literal miracle from God. Or whatever benevolent forces watch over fools like me. Every time I hear those words, I don't feel frustration or impatience. I feel nothing but overwhelming, shameful relief. Iliara blinked, utterly puzzled, her defensive posture deflating.
Relief? Why? I don't understand.
His face crumpled, and for the first time in the 6 months she had known him, lived with him, loved him, she saw tears gather in his warm brown eyes, spilling over to trace shining paths down his cheeks. Because I don't have a single credit to my name, Iliara. Not one. I'm broke. Completely and utterly broke. My ship is old, barely space-worthy, and the critical repairs it needed when I landed were mostly a fiction I invented to buy myself some time on a civilized planet with breathable air. I was planning to warp out, to sneak away the moment Tida finally said my ship was fixed, and get so far from this planet, from you, that you'd never, ever find me, or the trail of debts I've left across 3 systems. The tears were flowing freely now, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, and he reached for her hand with desperate, trembling fingers, his touch surprisingly cold. I'm sorry. Iliara, I'm so, so sorry for lying to you, for deceiving you, for taking advantage of your incredible kindness. I love you. Gods, I love you more than I thought was possible to love anyone. And I'll do anything, anything, to try and fix this, to make it right. I'll work in the deepest, darkest mines on Visar. I'll sell my ship for scrap, what little that is. I'll find a way to pay you back for every meal, every comfort, every moment of these past 6 months. Just, please, don't hate me. His voice broke entirely on the last word, and he buried his face in his hands, his body racked with a despair so profound it tore at his heart. Iliara stared at him, stunned into silence. Of all the catastrophic scenarios she'd meticulously imagined over the long, sleepless nights, this particular confession hadn't been one of them. He was worried about money, about taking advantage of her hospitality, about not being able to pay for his room and board. All this agony, this self-recrimination, was over something so mundane. The relief that flooded through her was so intense, so overwhelmingly potent, she almost laughed out loud, a hysterical giggle bubbling up in her throat. Instead, she gently, carefully, took his trembling hand from his face and placed it softly on her belly, where the slightest, almost imperceptible swell had just begun to show, a tiny new curve beneath the silk of her nightgown. "About that," she said softly, a small, tender smile playing on her lips. "I, too, have a few significant lies to confess, my dearest Miguel."